views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
So yes, there is a fear that, at any point someone could be outside my door.
Tonight on Politics Now, Nevada lawmakers take cover as the president's supporters storm the Capitol building. They describe the ordeal and what they believe should happen now. Plus,
and we already made some tough decisions and cut our state budget by 30%.
I don't believe 12% reductions across the board are the answer.
The legislative session is just weeks away. Leaders from both parties tell us their priorities in Carson City.
From 8 News Now, this is Politics Now.
It is in writing, but unfortunately, no United States Senator has joined in this effort.
In that case, the objection cannot be entertained.
And with that, Nevada's electoral votes for President-elect Joe Biden are finally counted. We thank you for joining us here on Politics Now. I'm John Langler. After a wild and troubling week in Washington, D.C., the normally mundane electoral vote counting process took an ugly turn on Wednesday. Inside the Capitol halls, a group of Republicans attempted to contest the results. Outside the walls, the president's supporters attacked the building and eventually got inside. The subsequent riot left one Capitol Hill police officer and at least 4 other people dead. Raquel Martin reports.
And the people's work continues.
After chaos erupted when the president's supporters forced their way into the halls of Congress, lawmakers returned to the Capitol to certify the Electoral College results.
Criminal behavior will never dominate the United States Congress.
We will not be diverted from our duty.
The uprising prompted some Republicans, like outgoing Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler, to reverse course.
And I cannot now in good conscience object to the certification.
Count me out. Enough is enough.
Still, more than 100 House lawmakers and 6 Republican senators voted to reject the Electoral College votes in some states.
And so this is the appropriate place for these concerns to be raised.
Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, who led objections in the Senate, insists unfounded allegations of fraud should be investigated. Democrats slammed the idea.
They're asking us to ignore court rulings, ignore Republican election officials, and even worse, ignore the will of the people.
And blame President Trump for stoking the violence.
This mob was invited to come to Washington on this day by this president.
The noes have it.
Ultimately, objections to results in Pennsylvania and Arizona were opposed.
Shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the person's elected president.
Congress certified Joe Biden's victory just after 3 a.m. In Washington, Raquel Martin.
Nevada's congressional delegation was among those left in hiding as the mob of President Trump's supporters descended on the Capitol building in Washington. The I-Team's David Charnes spoke with several of the lawmakers about their experience. David, hello.
Hey there, John. Well, Congresswoman Susie Lee was in her office when she received a text message saying to stay away from windows and seek cover. You can see here why. Here's what she told me about watching the complex get stormed. We talked to her on the phone as she remained in lockdown.
It was very scary because not only were you seeing our Capitol Police being overwhelmed on TV across the street, but then knowing that there were other instances that were requiring some attention, and not knowing if someone could possibly have breached the building that I was in.
Well, police did eventually get a handle on those rioters. They used tear gas, grenades, clearing those armed protesters from the area. Congresswoman Dina Titus tweeting this as she sat in lockdown. Quote, today, lawless domestic terrorists encouraged by the President of the United States attempted to destroy our democracy and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Nevada Senator Catherine Cortez Masto describing her ideal as well.
So they asked everybody to stay in their seats. They secured all the doors, said you're going to be safe here. They put Capitol Police on all the doors. And then we could hear the loud commotion. We could hear the voices and the noises outside.
And these are some of the photos she took hours after being moved to a secure location. Pretty scary stuff there at the Capitol on Wednesday, John.
Yeah, dramatic scenes from the nation's capital, David. Now, ever since Wednesday, there's been talk, mostly by Democrats, but by some Republicans, about either the 25th Amendment, but also possibly trying to impeach President Trump before his term ends. Where does Nevada's delegation stand on that?
Well, keep in mind, this would be a very short timeline since the president has just 2 weeks left in office. It would start, of course, in the House, just like the previous impeachment. 3 Nevada Democrats in the House, all 3 of them, Congresswoman Titus, Lee, Congressman Stephen Horsford as well, say they would vote for this. Senator CORTEZ MASTO telling me that she wants to see what the House does first before making a decision. And Senator Jackie Rosen has also not yet called for impeachment.
And David, any response from Nevada's only Republican on Capitol Hill in Washington, Congressman Mark Amodei?
No, John, he has not yet weighed in on this.
Well, we'll keep asking and we'll wait for an answer. David, thank you very much for the reaction from Washington from the congressional delegation after a very wild Wednesday. So there have been a lot of conspiracy theories circulating about who was actually involved in the riot on Capitol Hill. Those conspiracy theories, well, our Washington, D.C. correspondent Alexandra Limon has more on that. She was at the Capitol at the time of the riot. Alex, you were up on Capitol Hill when this all took place on Wednesday, so you saw it firsthand what it was like. In the aftermath, there have been some conspiracy theories about who really was involved in the riot up on Capitol Hill. What is known about who was taking part in this destruction on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, absolutely. And conspiracy theory is the right word for that. These online social media claims that Antifa or left-wing protesters were to blame for these protests. That is not the case. And there is plenty of evidence, video evidence of thousands of President Trump's supporters attending his rally where he spoke, where he told them to head to the Capitol. And then they did that. And a short time after that, they breached the Capitol. And again, 4 people died as a result. And after that happened in the evening, President Trump released that video message on social media, and even he didn't claim that they weren't his supporters. In fact, he said things like, "We love you, but please go home now." So even he admitted and knows they were his supporters who caused this violence and these riots in D.C. on Wednesday. So these claims that it was Antifa or somebody else are totally false. In fact, the mayor of D.C. said that the leader of the Proud Boys, for example, was arrested here in Washington this week. So we know who did this. It was right-wing groups like the Proud Boys and President Trump's supporters. There's no question about that.
Yeah. Quite the scene on Capitol Hill. Glad you're safe from it, and we'll certainly see how things play out. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. And we should point out, after we spoke with Alexandra, a 5th person died from the riot, that Capitol Hill police officer. Also, we should point out that arrests have started to be made by federal investigators since then, so this is an ongoing situation. The House Appropriations Committee is also looking into this. They are starting to investigate why Capitol Hill police were simply not prepared for what took place on Wednesday. Now, on the same day as the riot and the Electoral College vote, Georgia's 2 Senate seats both went Democratic. Democrat Raphael Warnock beat incumbent Republican Kelly Loeffler, and Jon Ossoff beat Republican David Perdue, another incumbent. Both victories were by more than would have triggered an automatic recount in Georgia as well, and the races have been conceded. In total, Democrats have picked up 4 Senate seats in Washington from the November election. So that splits the Senate 50-50, Republicans and Democrats. However, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, being a Democrat, she is the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so that gives Democrats control of the Senate, the House, and the White House when the inauguration takes place. Nevada Senator Catherine Cortez Masto chairs the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. In a joint statement with current Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, she said in part, Raphael and John have earned the trust and the support of voters across Georgia in a record-breaking election, and we look forward to fighting alongside them for health, jobs, and justice in the Senate. Coming up next on Politics Now, eyes on Carson City.
And I think our priorities are going to continue to be helping Nevada come out of this pandemic and this economic downturn.
Assembly Speaker Jason Frierson tells us about Democrat priorities in the legislative session. Plus,
we need to be open in some shape or form.
virtual or in person? That's Republican Assemblyman Tom Roberts. He tells us why he thinks the legislative session should be held safely.
Welcome back to Politics Now.
Nevada's 2021 legislative session starts February 1st. So we're going to focus on the big topics as going to be discussed at the session. I spoke with the leaders of each party, and we're going to start with Assembly Speaker Jason Frierson about his legislative priorities.
I remember over the summer, you and Attorney General Ford and others were over at the Grant Sawyer building discussing racial injustice, police reform during the Black Lives Matter protests. How much of that discussion will stretch into the legislative session? I know it was discussed at the special session to some extent, but what do you want to see discussed when all the lawmakers are back up in Carson City?
Well, I still think that we're going to have some discussions about social justice and about community policing and just ideas on how to best protect the public. I am committed to making sure that all of our stakeholders are at the table, including the law enforcement community. I think that we avoid unintended consequences when we have everybody at the table. But I do think that there are still ways that we can better police our community, better provide criminal justice more efficiently. And I think, there are some ways that we use money that might not be the most efficient or the wisest way to use money, whether it's how we treat traffic tickets, how we look at the cash bail system. I think, continuing to look at crime and punishment and whether or not we are being smart with our resources and incarcerating the most dangerous individuals, but not wasting taxpayer dollars, housing people that don't pose a risk of harm to the community. So those are conversations we'll continue to have, but we'll certainly have them with law enforcement at the table.
Have you had any conversations leading up to this session with Sheriff Lombardo, for example, other law enforcement leaders across the state about union members?
Yep. About
trying to put this into action?
I have absolutely had conversations. I was just on the phone with the sheriff a couple of days ago, and one of his members of the administration and I have a working relationship and are committed to reconnecting next week to just talk about where we are and where we can find common ground. I have asked them, tell me, what is it that would help you better meet the community's needs, meet your agency's needs. I think that the conversation with the police union has unfortunately become far more political and partisan than I think it warrants. And so we're going to work on that. I've committed with them to meeting with them weekly during session, and I'll follow through on that to hear them out and make sure that those perspectives are reflected in the policy discussions.
This is going to be a difficult legislative session. In your experience in public service, just how challenging is the task for you and all lawmakers to get the business done, given the limited resources, and also just given the circumstances of the pandemic?
It's going to be incredibly difficult. I don't know that I am aware of any session that has presented the kind of challenges that we're facing right now. We're facing challenges with respect to the tough budget decisions that we're going to have to make. But we're also facing, I think, political challenges about rhetoric and about how we're going to govern and how we're going to lead. I have always said that I believe there's power both in the majority and in the minority in crafting policy. And I think that we all are going to have to put partisanship aside at times and either advance policies that we think are good for the state or mitigate policies that we think maybe aren't so good for the state. And if any part of the machine walks away and doesn't participate in that, I think we're doing a disservice to Nevada. So I am hopeful that the four leaders of our four caucuses can continue to talk.
Speaker Frierson also says he thinks there will be fewer bills at the legislative session simply because of the precautions they're going to have to take during the pandemic. Republican Assemblyman Tom Roberts, he is the co-deputy minority floor leader. I spoke with him about Republican priorities at the legislative session, especially the budget, and how the session could be run during the pandemic.
How are you going to work with Democrats to try and achieve your needs and achieve the needs of your constituents while also still, staying within the confines of the budget?
During a special session, we cut the budgets pretty far back. I think you're going to see a continuation of a lot of those cuts due to the revenue shortfall from the governor's closures. Obviously the budget it's got really three big holes. Three big items that we fund. It's education, healthcare. And public safety issues, and actually delivering government services, to the state. And so, those are your biggest ones. And, we're going to have to ensure that we continue to provide services to the citizens of Nevada. But I think we also need to be cognizant that the federal government did put a lot of money into our state under the first relief act under COVID. I mean, almost $19 billion have came to our state, and our biannual budget is eight point something billion. I don't believe 12% reductions across the board are the answer. So it'd be interesting to see what the governor's proposal will be, coming up, and then we'll work from there.
Obviously, you were former assistant sheriff, and we've talked with current Sheriff Lombardo about issues of police reform in light of the Black Lives Matter protests. In my conversations with him, he has essentially said, at that time anyway, he had not had a lot of conversations with state lawmakers, with Clark County Commission. There hasn't been too much of an in-depth discussion of what's going to happen up in Carson City at the legislative session. So how much of that discussed reform do you think will actually get discussed at the legislative session?
Well, I think we did some things during a special session that law enforcement approved for the most part in the state. I know there's going to be some bills that are going to want to push reform further. I think folks like Sheriff Lombardo and police leaders in our state are willing to be at the table and talk about reform issues. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of things that we do in Nevada are considered best practices in the nation. We can always make improvements, and I think we're always willing to be at the table to talk about it.
The mechanics of the legislative session. Obviously, during the interim period, it's been mostly virtual. All of it's been virtual, essentially. Do you envision that continuing?
I certainly hope not. I believe, I've participated in some phone calls with some national organizations and heard from speakers and folks in other legislatures around the country, and other bodies have found a way to have limited public access and a reduced public access. We're not gonna. I just don't, under the current conditions. There's probably no way to be 100% open, but certainly we can figure out a way to have limited capacity, allow people to testify in hearings, to be able to ask questions. We can't do what we did during a special session, and have public comment for 2 minutes.
You can see the full interviews with Speaker Frierson and Assemblyman Roberts at 8newsnow.com. Just look for the Politics tab. Coming up next here on Politics Now, concerns about fairness.
As a governing trustee, she's going to be potentially in a position to make decisions that are adverse to CCEA.
What's ahead for the new Clark County School District Board? Welcome back to Politics Now. The largest local teachers union is threatening an ethics complaint against a new trustee. It claims Lisa Guzman is part of a rival teachers union, the Nevada State Education Association. The CCEA and the NSEA, they're involved in a lawsuit. CCEA staff say this creates a conflict of interest. The NSEA told us Guzman resigned as executive director of that union December 1st. However, they did not tell us that she was only given the title of assistant executive director instead. Guzman was one of 3 new trustees sworn in this week. Oracle Manna looks at the school board's busy agenda.
A warm welcome as 3 new CCSD trustees are sworn in Monday night. The biggest priority for them and the rest of the board is if and when to reopen schools amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
I wish I could give our families a straightforward answer.
Trustee EVELYN Garcia Morales doesn't want to rush a decision, especially with new changes being made to the hybrid learning proposal.
The model right now is currently being reassessed by the superintendent and his team. And so when I have the full picture, I will be able to make a better assessment.
But Trustee Katie Williams, who has gained a lot of attention for her outspoken tweet, supports in-person learning, saying distance education has been a burden for parents.
I think that those parents just need a release, they need a break, and what I'm trying to do is get the schools open for that reason.
Trustee Lisa Guzman says she wants to see more data, but the local teachers union CCEA claims there's a conflict of interest because of Guzman's executive role with the Nevada State Education Association.
As a governing trustee, she's going to be potentially in a position to make decisions that are adverse to CCEA.
CCEA wants Guzman to recuse herself from certain votes. Guzman says she'll do that if the Nevada Commission on Ethics says so.
I'm working with the CCSD to get some information from the ethics advisory so that we can clear this situation up.
And that was Oracle Manor reporting. In What to Watch this week, Governor Steve Sisolak has his State of the State address. This one, though, will be pre-recorded. It'll be published online January 19th. He'll outline the legislative priorities moving forward.